He invited her to his wedding to humiliate her, but she came with a Ferrari. Sarah Matthews stared at the gleaming red Ferrari 488 parked right in front of the church entrance, its engine still purring like a satisfied cat. The same woman who used to count pennies at the grocery store checkout 3 years ago stepped out wearing a dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. But here's the twist that no one saw coming, not even David, the groom who thought he was so clever, inviting his ex-girlfriend to his wedding day to show her what she'd lost. That Ferrari, it wasn't rented, it wasn't borrowed, and Sarah didn't marry some rich guy to get it. She earned every single dollar herself, and David was about to learn the most humbling lesson of his life. But before we dive into this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you're enjoying this story so far, hit that like button and subscribe. David Harrison thought he was God's gift to women 3 years ago. He had his life planned out like a chess game, and Sarah was just supposed to be a stepping stone to something better. They'd been together for 2 years, living in a cramped studio apartment where the walls were so thin they could hear their neighbors' every conversation. Sarah worked double shifts at a local diner, her hands constantly smelling like coffee and French fries, while David was climbing the corporate ladder at a tech startup, convinced he was destined for greatness. The thing about being young and arrogant is that you mistake ambition for character. David started seeing Sarah's simple dreams as limitations. While he was networking with executives and reading business journals, she'd come home exhausted, talking about her regular customers and how Mrs. Patterson always left her a $5 tip on Tuesdays. He began to see her contentment as a lack of drive, her kindness as naivety, and her loyalty as desperation. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday evening. Sarah had surprised David with his favorite dinner, spaghetti carbonara made from scratch, and she was wearing this yellow sundress that always made her eyes sparkle. She was so excited to share her news that she was practically bouncing on her toes. "David, you'll never guess what happened today," she said, her face glowing with excitement. "Remember how I've been saving up? Well, I finally have enough to enroll in those online business courses. I'm going to start my own catering company. Can you believe it? Me, Sarah, from nowhere, starting a real business." David should have celebrated with her. He should have seen the fire in her eyes and the determination in her voice. Instead, all he could think about was Jessica, the marketing executive he'd been flirting with at work. Jessica, who wore designer suits and talked about her vacation home in the Hamptons. Jessica, who represented everything he thought he wanted in life. "That's nice, babe," David said, without even looking up from his laptop. "But maybe you should think bigger. Catering is such a saturated market." The light in Sarah's eyes dimmed just a little, but she pressed on. "I've done my research, David. I have a solid business plan and everything. Mrs. Patterson's daughter owns an event planning company, and she said she'd give me a chance if I can prove myself with smaller events first." "Mrs. Patterson," David laughed, not kindly. "Sarah, these people aren't going to help you build an empire. You're thinking too small." What David said next, no one can ever take back, and it haunts everyone who heard this story. Maybe we're just growing in different directions. Maybe we want different things out of life. The fork slipped from Sarah's hand, clattering against the plate. "What are you saying, David?" "I'm saying maybe this relationship has run its course. You're content with small-town dreams, and I'm thinking globally. It's nobody's fault, but we're just not compatible anymore." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah sat there, still in that yellow sundress, processing the fact that the man she'd been planning a future with was essentially telling her she wasn't good enough for his grand ambitions. When she finally spoke, her voice was so quiet David almost missed it. "I see. So all those times you said we were a team, all those late-night conversations about building something together, that was just you keeping me around until someone better came along?" David wanted to deny it, but the truth was written all over his face. Sarah nodded slowly, like she was filing away this moment for future reference, and then she did something that surprised him. She didn't cry, she didn't yell. She simply stood up, gathered her purse, and walked toward the door. "Sarah, wait," David called after her, suddenly panicked by her calmness. She turned back, and for a split second, David saw something in her eyes that he'd never seen before. It wasn't hurt or anger, it was resolve. You know what, David? You're absolutely right. We do want different things. I want to build something meaningful with someone who sees my dreams as valid, not as stepping stones to something better. And you want to climb a ladder that's only tall enough for one person. She paused at the door. I hope you find what you're looking for. I really do. And just like that, she was gone. No drama, no broken dishes, no tearful pleading. Just the quiet click of the door closing and the sudden realization that David might have just made the biggest mistake of his life. But David's ego wouldn't let him admit that. Within 2 weeks he was dating Jessica, and within 6 months they were engaged. Jessica was everything David thought he wanted: sophisticated, well-connected, and ambitious. She looked perfect on his arm at company events, and their relationship felt like a business partnership, disguised as a romance, which, looking back, is exactly what it was. Planning their wedding became Jessica's full-time obsession. Everything had to be perfect, expensive, and Instagram-worthy. The venue alone cost more than Sarah and David used to spend in 6 months. And that's when the idea came to David, sick and twisted as it was. He would invite Sarah to the wedding. You want to invite your ex-girlfriend to our wedding? Jessica asked, raising one perfectly sculpted eyebrow. Think about it, David said, feeling clever. She'll see what she gave up. She'll see how much better my life got without her. It's the ultimate closure. Jessica actually smiled at this. I like it. Very alpha move. Plus, it'll make for great photos, seeing her reaction to what real success looks like. So David sent the invitation. Sarah Matthews, 1247 Oak Street, apartment 3B. The same tiny apartment she was living in when they broke up. David imagined her opening the heavy cardstock invitation, seeing the elegant calligraphy and expensive paper, and finally understanding the magnitude of what she'd lost. He pictured her RSVPing with some excuse about being busy, too intimidated to actually show up. But Sarah surprised everyone again. She RSVP'd yes, with a simple note. Looking forward to celebrating your new chapter. Congratulations to both of you. The morning of the wedding, everything was perfect. The church was decorated with thousands of white roses. Jessica looked stunning in her designer gown, and David felt like he was finally getting everything he deserved. His groomsmen were making jokes about Sarah showing up, wondering if she'd wear her old diner uniform or if she'd even be able to afford a decent dress for the occasion. That's when they heard it. The sound of an engine that didn't belong in their modest church parking lot. It was low and powerful, the kind of sound that makes people stop conversations mid-sentence. David peeked out the window of the church vestry, expecting to see maybe the wedding photographer's car or a late-arriving guest. Instead, he saw that Ferrari, cherry red gleaming in the morning sun, and so out of place in their small-town church parking lot that it might as well have been a spaceship. The engine shut off, and the driver's side door opened. Out stepped Sarah. But this wasn't the Sarah David remembered. This Sarah wore confidence like a second skin. Her hair was styled in an elegant updo that probably cost more than their old monthly rent, and her dress was simple but clearly expensive, the kind of understated elegance that screams money without trying. She moved with a grace David had never seen before, like she owned not just the car, but the entire world around her. David's best man, Jake, whistled low. Dude, please tell me that's not your ex. But it was. Sarah Matthews, the girl who used to save up for weeks to buy a new pair of shoes, had just arrived at David's wedding in a Ferrari that cost more than most people's houses. The girl David had left because she thought too small had apparently learned to think very, very big. How is that possible? David whispered, more to himself than to Jake. Maybe she married rich, Jake suggested, but even as he said it, they both knew that wasn't right. Sarah wasn't wearing a wedding ring, and more importantly, she had that look of someone who'd earned everything herself. There's a difference between inherited confidence and built confidence, and Sarah was radiating the latter. The ceremony was supposed to start in 20 minutes, but David couldn't focus on anything except that Ferrari and the woman who'd stepped out of it. Jessica was in the bridal suite, probably touching up her makeup for the 100th time, completely unaware that David's entire world had just been flipped upside down. David had to know. He had to understand how the woman he'd dismissed as unambitious had ended up driving a car that represented everything he'd been chasing for the past 3 years. Against Jake's protests, David slipped out of the vestry and made his way toward the church entrance. Sarah was talking to the usher, her laugh carrying the same warmth David remembered, but there was something new there too: authority. This wasn't the uncertain girl who used to second-guess her business ideas. This was a woman who clearly knew exactly what she was worth. "Sarah," David called out, trying to keep his voice casual. She turned, and when their eyes met, David saw something he didn't expect. Not anger, not hurt, not even satisfaction. Just a kind of peaceful acknowledgement, like she was greeting an old acquaintance who'd once been mildly important in her life. "David," she smiled, and it was genuine. "Congratulations. This is beautiful." She gestured around the church, taking in the elaborate decorations. "Thank you," David managed. "You look different. Good, different. Thank you. You look exactly the same." There was no malice in her words, but somehow they cut deeper than any insult could have. She wasn't trying to hurt him, she was simply stating a fact. David was exactly the same person he'd been 3 years ago, while she had clearly become someone entirely new. "So," David said, trying to sound nonchalant, "nice car." Sarah's smile widened. "Oh, the Ferrari, thank you. I've been wanting one for years, and I finally decided to treat myself." Treat herself, like a Ferrari was a dinner out or a new pair of shoes. "What do you do now?" David asked, abandoning any pretense of casualness. "I run a company," she said simply. "Started with catering, actually. Remember those business courses I was excited about? Turns out they were exactly what I needed." The usher was trying to get David's attention, probably to tell him the ceremony needed to start, but he couldn't move. "What kind of company?" "Event management and luxury catering. We handle everything from intimate dinner parties to corporate events for Fortune 500 companies. Last month we catered the mayor's daughter's wedding, and next week we're doing a product launch for a tech startup that just went public." She paused, studying David's face. "Actually, they might be competitors of yours. Quantum Dynamics." David's mouth went dry. Quantum Dynamics was the company that had poached half their best clients 6 months ago. They were everything David's startup wished they could be. "You catered their product launch?" David asked weakly. 12-course tasting menu for 200 of their closest investors. The CEO personally thanked me and said it was the best event his company had ever hosted. He's actually become a good friend." She said this last part with a subtle emphasis that made David wonder just how good a friend he'd become. The pieces were starting to fall into place, and the picture they were forming made David feel physically sick. While he'd been climbing the corporate ladder at a struggling startup, Sarah had built her own ladder and climbed straight to the top. While he'd been chasing other people's definitions of success, she'd created her own. "The Ferrari," David said, though he wasn't really asking a question anymore. "Cash," she replied simply. "I've never been one for debt. Remember how I used to save every penny? Turns out that habit serves you well when you're building a business from the ground up." Jake appeared at David's elbow, hissing urgently. "David, we need to start. Jessica is losing her mind." Sarah must have heard him because she stepped back gracefully. "I should let you get to your wedding. Jessica's a lucky woman." Again, there was no sarcasm, no hidden meaning. She genuinely seemed to mean it. "Sarah, wait," David said, though he had no idea what he wanted to say. She paused, her head tilted in that patient way David remembered from 1,000 conversations in their old apartment. "I need to know," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Did you come here to show off? To make me see what I'd lost?" Sarah's expression softened, and for a moment, David saw a glimpse of the girl he'd once known. "Oh, David," she said, and her voice was full of something that might have been pity. "I came here because you invited me to celebrate your happiness, and celebrating other people's happiness is something I've learned to value. The car, the dress, the business, none of that was for you. I stopped living my life in reaction to what you thought or wanted a long time ago." The truth of her words hit David like a physical blow. She hadn't come there to make him jealous or to prove a point. She'd come because she was genuinely happy for him, and secure enough in her own life to celebrate someone else's joy, even if that someone was the person who'd once told her she wasn't good enough. "I have to ask," David said, knowing he was about to humiliate himself but unable to stop. "Do you ever think about us? About what might have been?" Sarah considered this for a long moment, and David could see her choosing her words carefully. "I think about the lesson you taught me," she said finally. "You showed me that I needed to stop waiting for someone else to validate my dreams. You taught me that the only person who needs to believe in Sarah Matthews is Sarah Matthews. So in a way, I'm grateful." "Grateful," David repeated, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "David," Jake was pulling at his arm now, "Jessica is about to come out here looking for you." Sarah must have sensed the urgency because she stepped back again. "Go," she said gently. "This is your day. Don't let me distract from that." But as David turned to walk back into the church, she called out once more. "David? For what it's worth, I hope you find what you're really looking for, and I hope you recognize it when you do." The ceremony passed in a blur. David stood at the altar, repeating vows that suddenly felt like lines from a play he didn't want to be in, watching Jessica beam at their guests like a queen accepting tribute. Every time he glanced toward the pews, he caught sight of Sarah sitting in the back row, genuinely smiling and even dabbing her eyes with a tissue during their vows. She was happy for them. Actually, truly happy for them. During the reception, David watched from across the room as Sarah mingled with the other guests. She wasn't holding court or drawing attention to herself, but people were naturally gravitating toward her. David overheard snippets of conversation where she was giving business advice to his cousin's husband, discussing art with his elderly aunt, and making his little niece laugh with some story about a wedding cake disaster she'd once had to fix on the fly. This was the woman David had dismissed as unambitious, the woman he'd thought was holding him back from his destiny. She hadn't just succeeded in spite of his rejection, she'd flourished because of her freedom from his limitations. Jessica noticed David watching Sarah and sidled up with a champagne flute in her hand. "She's not what I expected," she said, her voice tight. "What did you expect?" David asked. "I don't know. Someone more ordinary, I guess. Someone who would make it obvious why you upgraded." Jessica's use of the word upgraded made David wince. Instead, she looks like she could buy and sell this entire wedding without thinking about it. The worst part was that Jessica was right. Sarah's quiet confidence made everyone else at the reception, including the bride, look like they were trying too hard. She wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone, and that made her magnetic in a way that all of Jessica's carefully curated perfection couldn't match. When it came time for Sarah to leave, she approached them at the head table. "Thank you for including me," she said to Jessica. "Your wedding was absolutely beautiful." "Thank you for coming," Jessica replied, though her smile was strained. "Your business sounds fascinating. Maybe we could grab coffee sometime, and you could tell me more about it." "I'd love that," Sarah said, and she seemed to genuinely mean it. She turned to David. "David, I wish you both all the happiness in the world." She leaned in to give David a brief, friendly hug, and for just a moment, he was surrounded by her familiar scent, something clean and warm that he'd forgotten he missed. "Take care of yourself," she whispered, so quietly that only David could hear. And then she was walking away, her heels clicking confidently across the reception hall floor. David watched through the windows as she got into that Ferrari, the engine purring to life with a sound like contained power. She drove away without looking back, and David knew, with absolute certainty, that he would never see her again. The marriage to Jessica lasted 18 months. It turned out that a relationship built on mutual ambition and social climbing doesn't have much to sustain it when the ambition starts to falter and the social climbing gets tedious. They divorced amicably, splitting their accumulated assets and going their separate ways with barely more emotion than they'd shown signing a business contract. In the aftermath, David did some research on Sarah's company. Matthews Events had become one of the most sought-after luxury event planning services on the East Coast. They'd expanded into 3 cities, employed over 50 people, and had a client list that read like a who's who of corporate America. Sarah herself had been featured in Forbes's 30 Under 30 list and had given a TED Talk about building authentic success from the ground up. David watched that TED Talk about a dozen times, sitting in his apartment that was somehow smaller and less comfortable than the studio Sarah and he used to share. She looked radiant under the stage lights, speaking passionately about the importance of defining success for yourself rather than letting others define it for you. "The moment I stopped trying to fit into someone else's vision of who I should be," she said to the audience, "was the moment I became who I was always meant to be. Don't let anyone convince you that your dreams are too small or too big or too anything. They're yours, and that makes them perfect." The audience gave her a standing ovation, and David found himself clapping alone in his living room, 3 years too late. David never reached out to her. What would he have said? That he was sorry for not seeing her worth? That he was proud of what she'd accomplished? That he realized he'd given up the best thing in his life because he was too immature to recognize it? All of those things were true, but they were also irrelevant. Sarah had moved on, not just from him, but from needing any kind of validation or closure from him. Sometimes people wonder if David learned anything from the experience, and honestly, that's still being figured out. What's clear is that success looks different than David thought it did when he was 25. Ambition without compassion is just selfishness with a business plan, and the person you become matters more than the things you accumulate. Sarah Matthews taught David the most important lesson of his life, not through anything she said, but through who she chose to become. She showed him that the best revenge isn't arriving in a Ferrari to make your ex jealous. The best revenge is living so well that you forget why you wanted revenge in the first place. That Ferrari wasn't a message to David. It was a reward she'd given herself for staying true to her dreams when it would have been easier to make them smaller. That success wasn't about proving David wrong. It was about proving herself right. And maybe that's the real twist in this story. David thought he was inviting Sarah to his wedding to show her what she'd lost. Instead, she showed him what he'd thrown away, not through any grand gesture or dramatic confrontation, but simply by being the person she'd always had the potential to be. If you made it this far into the story, hopefully it made you think about your own dreams and the people who either support them or dismiss them. Sarah's success wasn't built on revenge or spite. It was built on self-belief and hard work and the refusal to let anyone else's limitations become her own. So here's the question for you. What dreams are you making smaller because someone else can't see their value? What Ferrari are you denying yourself because you're still trying to fit into someone else's vision of who you should be? Let us know in the comments. And if this story inspired you to think differently about success and ambition, make sure you subscribe for more stories about the moments that change everything. Remember, the best revenge is living well, but the best life is the one you build for yourself, not in spite of anyone else, but because of who you choose to become.